Hello and welcome to my workshop. So we're going to be getting back on this little Jeep here, and this is a replica of the LS male Jeep crawler. We made a lot of work last time. This time we're going to finish up the body and get this thing mated up to a chassis. Alright, so let's get started. So I'm taking this I believe it was 1/2 inch styrene and just cutting little slivers down and using that to place inside where the taillights would go as kind of a little bezel. Now the front, I'm using these 12 volt LED, I think they're intended for like a bed of a pickup truck or something like that. So you can run them straight off of 3S, and they have their own heat sink. So I'm basically putting them in the front where the Jeep lights would go, and they're the exact same size. They fit right in, but I needed a way to mount them. So what I ended up doing is just taking a piece of aluminum and mounting them to that aluminum, and that holds them in the correct orientation. I've had this little 3D printed radiator kicking around for years. I forget exactly where I got it from. I tried it on several different builds and none of them quite looked right. This was perfect. It was exactly the right size. Everything was just exactly perfect. So, you know, finally after holding on this part for several years, I was able to find a home for it. Though I'm trying to attach all this stuff with screws so it can be pulled back apart and painted separately. It's always easier to do that. Now in the rear there's a latch that opens up the door, obviously. And what I'm using is a 3D printed part from a Pushrod 3D, and it's just a little simple latch they designed up. And essentially I just cut a hole the same size, file it down a little bit, and then pop that thing in. So I wasn't actually sure what this thing on the roof was. It looked like some kind of a vent, an opening. But I wasn't 100% sure. I got a couple different pictures I was looking at. I finally just got in contact with the guy that actually built the real Jeep, and we hooked up on social media and was able to. He offered to answer some questions for me as I arose. So one of these questions was, well, what is this thing? So he sent some detailed pictures from the inside, and essentially it's like an oval-shaped vent, and it hinges up from the back and allows, I guess, fresh air to come in. And then the roof covering is I guess, just to simply keep the water from pouring in. I was a little worried about this thing being on the top and being somewhat flimsy, but after everything was put together and all the different angles and stuff, it actually turned out pretty sturdy, so I think it's going to be okay. So not only with the headlights, but there are also a couple of running lights that he has on here. And so I just pulled out some different lenses I have laying around. And I think the small ones are literally just basically just LEDs. And the 3mm LEDs, I cut the wire off. I'm not going to wire them up, but they could be. And so I just paint these things amber, and the headlights will be the only thing that turns on. So I was getting ready to make the hinges. I thought, well, I'll just go ahead and do what I've done on so many of the other ones and start off with these real metal hinges. Glue them together, cut them down, And the more I started looking at it, the more I realized it's really looks a little different on this. And so I ended up just deciding to make these out of styrene. So here I'm just making the bottom plate, and then what I'll do is I'll come back with a styrene rod and use that to represent the hinge on it. And in the end, I think it turned out better doing it this way than cutting it down the metal ones. You can see that it's got a really long tang on one side. It almost looks like a hinge from a gate. You'll see that most of the gates will have a kind of a narrow side. It looks almost like a door hinge, and then the other side will be this long extended tang. So that's what this looked like, and that's the reason why I didn't go with the metal, because it just wasn't enough material there, and by the time I added some stuff on, it just made more sense to make it from scratch. So the body isn't 100% complete, but most of the stuff is on there. And so what I really wanted to do was focus on getting the roll cage and getting that figured out. I know it's going to be a challenge to get the roll cage built and then installed into the Jeep. I wanted to maintain the floor at the height that is. I'm still not 100% sure that's going to happen, but essentially what I was going to do is work the cage in from the back. So in an attempt to try to keep everything square, what I did was I made this little wooden plate, and I ended up taking this tubing and silver soldered into the end of the tubing, re-drilled the hole back out, and then tapped it. And that allowed me to take some screws and get those pieces held upright onto that wood. And so once I had the basic structure held into the wood, it's just a matter of cutting in the individual pieces, fitting them into the cage however it needed to be, using whatever means that necessary to get the thing blocked up, and then just continuously silver soldering new pieces on. So up until this point, I did not have a chassis at all to go off of. I'd had dimensions and I understood the widths and everything, but I didn't have the whole truck with me. So the truck is obviously now here, and it's a VS410. And so what I'm doing now is just kind of stripping this thing down to the bare essentials in order for me to figure out how best I'm going to be able to get all these parts on here. So one of the things I figured out right away is there's no way in the world I'm going to be able to keep this servo winch. So the real Jeep has the winch sitting out in front of the grill, kind of typically where a Jeep would have their winch normally if you put one on. But most of the older style had this really extended bumper on the front. So I figured I was going to end up having to do that. So unfortunately the servo winch did not make the cut. And speaking of cut, so here is my first attempt at cutting the chassis. Right off the bat, those little fiber discs broke. I always wear my goggles when I'm cutting with these things, because you just look at them cross-eyed and they will break. So my first cut was to get rid of the rear, and so I could kind of get the body to sink down a little bit. And I still was kind of up in the air about where I wanted to cut the front. But after some careful measurements, I decided a good spot to cut it. Basically, did very similar chop to the front as I did the rear. So the LSML Jeep has these like armor plating pieces down the side, which are almost like rock sliders. And I started looking around what I have and how I could make those, and I found this aluminum extruded pieces that I thought would work, and so I just figured I'd give it a try, and I cut them down, started carving into them with the Dremel tool, and shaping them to to fit how I thought would look the best. What they ended up with was a really neat design where the sliders actually hold the body. The funny thing about it is I posted this stuff on social media, and like I said, I've been contacting the owner of the real one, and he told me that He built his real sliders exactly like I built these replica ones, and because the DJ5 body is kind of known to sag in the middle, so his sliders actually are what holds the body up as well. So in order to mount these little sliders on the side, I was able to use the, I'm assuming these are factory pieces for the VS410. I'm not overly familiar with this chassis, but they look like they were part of the original kit. So the only thing I had to do in the back is I had to space out the rear one with 2 washers on each side, and just the way the body tapers. But other than that, you know, they just bolted right onto these. There's like a little skid plate underneath that you mount. I might come back later and make a piece that wraps all the way around the end of that to kind of cover that gap up, but for right now it works out pretty well. If you saw that, what I did, I made a slit, and it goes down into the where that stop is for the front door. The rest of it was just left fully extended. So now I'm just coming back and marking out where I want to remove material to make it match up to the real one. So that's one of the things you always try to do, is to match one side to the next. So wherever possible, you can bolt them together or clamp them together and do all your filing and sanding at the same time. So the way these things were tapered, I couldn't get a regular wrench down into here, so I was able to use this little tiny Allen wrench trying to turn and tighten up this screw. I realized later all I have to do is unbolt the legs from the chassis, and then you can bolt the side pieces on and then bolt the legs right back on. But so as you see, I'm using an old set of axial rails and just harvesting off the straight section in the end, trying to get some material so I can build those extensions. Moving on to the front, I'm trying to get the front bumper all sorted out. So what I'm having to do is get a drop down section to get the rails to shoot forward from the grill there. The VS410 chassis has this really high arches going over the axles, which I guess is good for performance, but it's horrible for trying to get a body to fit on there later. It just really is all up in the way. The bumpers would never line up right. I guess it's good for a Lexan body, but you know, for a hard body and trying to get these other things done, it really is a challenge to get that set. So for the bumper, it's actually pretty simple. It's a thin-walled, half-inch square tubing. I cut the back side out, and then I made a score line down the inside with the cutoff tool, but not all the way through, and then I just basically took that handbrake and bent the material up a little bit to give it a little bit of an angle, and that's really all the bumper is. So I'm taking these scale metal supply tabs, getting those shaped to fit down into the bumper, and then what that allowed me to do is to solder these to the bumper, and then have a screw hole where I can then take the bumper on and off from the front of the chassis, and that way the chassis can still separate just like it was from the factory. So one of the hardest things to do when you're making these chassis or doing any kind of a work like this is to get this thing held in position and get it held accurately. You basically have to come up with all kinds of different jigs, thinking outside the box, developing different strategies for each situation. Just take your time, kind of think through it. You can get this stuff done, and wherever possible, like bolt stuff together and then come back and silver solder it. So in my situation, I felt confident enough to be able to place these by hand. So essentially I'm just kind of heating up the area, heating up the tab, melting some silver solder down in there, and then placing the tab back into the silver solder, and doing any kind of repositioning I need. So here, pulled the entire chassis apart. Like I said, get the thing bolted together the best you can. And so I just used the actual chassis and a little spacer I came up with to get the thing the exact right dimension I needed. So the little piece of, I don't know how thick Delrin it is, but it's a pretty thick piece of Delrin. And basically just using that as a spacer to keep the front end from racking, as well as a place to mount the winch later on. So that little 3-racing winch, it has the fairleads come off, and there's these little nubs that are sticking down, actually hangs down below where the flange would go. So in order for that to to sit flush, I ended up basically drilling a little tiny holes in the bumper. You can see just basically having some access holes from underneath. You bolt the flange that holds the 3-racing winch down first, and then you have those access holes to put the screws in from underneath and actually tighten the winch down. The rear bumper is pretty similar to the front. Starts off with 1/2-inch thin wall tubing. What I'm doing differently here is I'm cutting off all but 2 sides. I'm doing that because I might end up having to thin it down. It's not quite as thick as the front bumper was, so I'm going to end up having to solder a piece back on. So similar to the front, I've opened it up in the back by removing a piece, and then made a score line with the cutoff tool, enabled me to bend that one wall over to give a little bit of an angle. So here I'm using basically the Scale Metal Supplies tab sheet to cut out a piece. So I was doing something dumb here. I was cutting at an angle that wasn't probably the best way. Had some vibrations from that, and due to the vise clamping down and having all that energy built up, it when it came loose, it just flew, and it flew right by my face. And luckily I always wear my goggles and there was no harm, but that could have been a bad situation. I ended up having to do a drop type style chassis in the rear, similar to what I did the front, and I ended up using a cutoff from this chassis itself, and it basically just silver soldered a piece on there, and what that'll do is that'll bolt into the end of the chassis rail. A quick coat of satin black, and like I said, just bolt everything together, and it really does make a huge difference in the way this truck looks. Yeah, I'm really excited about how this Jeep is turning out. It's been a blast building this thing. It's a lot of fun. Really can't wait to get this thing done, and excited to get it finished up.